Hello, welcome to the Whispered Abyss channel. Happy viewing. Ethan Reed tossed his coffee-stained shirt into the laundry basket, muttering under his breath. It had been another unremarkable day, marred by minor annoyances. Freelancing from home blurred the boundaries between work and life, leaving him trapped in a haze of deadlines and self-doubt. Sophie had been supportive, mostly, but even she grew tired of his constant overthinking. The sound of the mail slot clinking broke the monotony. Ethan set his laptop aside and shuffled to the door. Among the usual bills and flyers, a plain white envelope caught his eye. No name, no return address. Curiosity piqued, he opened it. The paper inside was unlined, the handwriting neat but impersonal. You spilled coffee on a stranger today. You didn't apologize. It wasn't an accident, was it? Ethan frowned, his pulse quickening. Who would send this? He recalled the incident that morning, a hasty trip to the cafe, his cup tipping over as he juggled his phone. The man's glare had lingered, but Ethan had mumbled a quick sorry and rushed out. He reread the letter. The phrasing was accusatory, almost mocking. It felt invasive, like someone had been watching. "Who's it from?" Sophie asked, leaning against the doorway. She was wearing her favorite oversized hoodie, her hair pulled into a messy bun. Her casual presence grounded him for a moment. "No idea," Ethan replied, handing her the note. She skimmed it, her lips twisting into a skeptical smile. "Probably a prank. Some kid trying to mess with you." "Maybe." Ethan didn't sound convinced. Sophie handed the letter back. "Don't let it get to you. People are weird." She kissed his cheek and disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept circling back. Who had seen him? And why bother writing about such a trivial moment? The next day, Ethan found another envelope. This time, the letter detailed his decision to skip an important client call. It had been a calculated risk, prioritizing a tighter deadline over an uninspiring pitch. But the letter wasn't just an observation. It accused him of laziness. "You keep avoiding your responsibilities. How long until it catches up with you?" Ethan's breath hitched. The handwriting matched the first letter. He scanned his surroundings, his small apartment feeling suddenly claustrophobic. When Sophie returned that evening, he showed her the second letter. "This isn't just a prank," he insisted. "Then what is it?" she asked, her tone even but tired. "I don't know, but someone's watching me." Her brow furrowed. "Ethan, no one cares about your spilled coffee or missed calls. You're overthinking this." "What if they're warning me?" His voice wavered. Sophie sighed. "Look, if it happens again, we'll call the police. But don't let this spiral, okay?" Ethan nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the letters weren't random. They felt deliberate, targeted, as though someone knew him better than he cared to admit. Ethan tried to dismiss the letters, convincing himself Sophie was right. It had to be a prank. But when the third letter arrived, his fragile sense of normalcy shattered. It came 2 days later, delivered in the same plain envelope. "Your latest article? Dull. No heart, no voice. You used to be better than this." The critique stung more than he wanted to admit. Ethan's most recent piece had been a rushed job, hastily written for a client who demanded quantity over quality. But how could this stranger know? He showed Sophie the letter as soon as she came home. Her reaction was predictable. "Okay, this is getting creepy," she admitted, tossing her bag onto the couch. "But it still feels like a joke. Maybe one of your clients is messing with you." Ethan shook his head. No client would waste time like this, and they wouldn't have known about the coffee incident. Then maybe someone you know? A neighbor? She paused, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. Or a coworker. I don't have coworkers, Sophie. I barely even have friends, he snapped. Regret immediately followed. I didn't mean it like that. She softened. I know. I'm just saying. It has to be someone with access to you. Let's think about this logically. Ethan wanted to think logically, but logic wasn't enough to explain the growing specificity of the letters. The fourth letter arrived 2 days later, its contents both infuriating and chilling. You've become predictable, Ethan, writing the same tired stories, following the same dull routines. How long before Sophie gets bored of you, too? He crumpled the letter in his fist, his anger rising. This wasn't just creepy. It was invasive. The mention of Sophie crossed a line, dragging her into a private torment he could barely endure himself. I'm done playing along, he muttered, grabbing his laptop. What are you doing? Sophie asked, watching him type furiously. Searching for cameras, bugs, anything that could explain how they're watching me. That's a little extreme, don't you think? Extreme is someone stalking me and writing letters about it. Ethan spent the evening scouring the apartment. He checked every corner, every vent, even dismantling a smoke detector. Sophie tried to stop him, but his paranoia drowned out her protests. By midnight, the place was in shambles, and he was no closer to an answer. The next morning, he installed a small camera near the front door, aimed at the mail slot. He didn't tell Sophie. She already thought he was losing it, but he needed proof. 2 days passed before the camera captured something. The envelope slid through the mail slot as usual, but the footage showed no hand, no person. It was as though the letter had appeared out of thin air. Ethan rewound the footage a dozen times, each viewing leaving him more confused. He called Sophie over, desperation edging his voice. Look, there's nothing. No one delivering these. Sophie watched silently, her face unreadable. So, what are you saying? She finally asked. I don't know. Maybe they're hiding, or... He hesitated. Maybe it's something else. Sophie stepped back, crossing her arms. You think it's supernatural? I don't know what to think anymore. Maybe we should talk to someone, she suggested carefully. You mean a therapist? Or the police, she countered. This isn't healthy, Ethan. Ethan wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. Something was wrong. Whether with the letters or with himself, he couldn't tell. The next letter made the decision for him. Stop looking for me, Ethan. You'll only make it worse. Ethan stared at the latest letter, his hands trembling. The words seemed alive, crawling off the page and burrowing into his mind. The air in the apartment felt heavy, stifling, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He showed Sophie the note, his voice barely a whisper. They know I'm trying to find them. Sophie's face darkened. She sat beside him, holding the letter with deliberate care. This has gone too far, Ethan. We're going to the police. They'll laugh at me. Anonymous letters aren't exactly a top priority. Then we'll make it their priority, she said firmly. Reluctantly, Ethan agreed. At the precinct, a board officer took their statement and the letters. He assured them he'd look into it, with the kind of dismissive tone that made Ethan's stomach sink. On the way home, Sophie tried to lighten the mood. At least it's documented now. If anything happens, they'll take it seriously. Ethan nodded, but remained unconvinced. That night, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent his heart racing. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were vivid and cruel. A faceless figure standing at the foot of his bed, whispering his failures in a voice he almost recognized. The next morning, Ethan awoke to Sophie shaking him gently. "There's another one," she said, her voice tight with worry. The envelope lay on the kitchen table, identical to the others. He hesitated before opening it. "You think they'll protect you? They won't. They never do." Ethan slammed the letter onto the table, his frustration boiling over. "This is pointless. Whoever this is, they're just playing games." Sophie placed a hand on his arm. "We don't know that. Maybe it's someone trying to manipulate you, someone with a grudge." "I don't have enemies, Sophie. I barely have anyone." Her expression softened, but she didn't reply. That evening, Ethan buried himself in research. He combed through old emails, social media interactions, even client feedback, looking for any sign of someone who might harbor ill will. But nothing stood out. The only clue came from his camera footage, or rather, the lack of it. He'd installed additional cameras, but each time a letter arrived, the recordings were blank. No sound, no motion, just a gap where time itself seemed to vanish. His paranoia deepened. He stopped leaving the apartment, convinced the outside world was just as unsafe. Sophie tried to intervene, coaxing him out with small errands or walks, but he refused. "Every time I step outside, I give them more to write about," he argued. "But you can't live like this," she said, her tone strained. Ethan shot her a look, his eyes wild. "You don't understand. They're watching. Every mistake, every misstep. They're documenting everything." Sophie didn't reply, but he saw the worry etched into her features. That night, Ethan dreamt again. The faceless figure was closer this time, its voice louder, its words more cutting. "You think she'll stay? She's already slipping away. You're just dragging her down?" Ethan woke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. He turned to Sophie's side of the bed, but it was empty. He found her in the living room, curled up on the couch with her phone. She looked up as he approached, her eyes red-rimmed. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "Me neither," he admitted. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of unspoken fears hanging between them. The tension in the apartment was palpable. Ethan spent his days obsessively analyzing the letters, the camera footage, and every detail of his life that might offer a clue. Sophie, once his anchor, seemed increasingly distant, her patience fraying under the relentless pressure. Another letter arrived that evening. This time, it bore no taunts or critiques. Instead, it was a simple yet chilling message. "She's lying to you." Ethan's hands shook as he read the words. He turned to Sophie, who was cooking in the kitchen, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his mind. "What's that one say?" she asked casually, not looking up. He hesitated. "Nothing important, just more of the same." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, but Ethan's mind raced. Could the letters be right? Was Sophie hiding something from him? He shook the thought away, disgusted with himself. This was exactly what the writer wanted, to plant seeds of doubt, to isolate him. But as the days passed, the idea took root. He began to notice small things. The way Sophie's phone would light up with messages she quickly dismissed. Her late-night calls with a friend. The way she'd avoid meeting his eyes when he brought up the letters. One night, unable to contain his paranoia, he confronted her. "Who are you talking to all the time?" he demanded, his voice sharper than intended. Sophie frowned, setting her phone down. What are you talking about? Those calls, those texts, are they about me? About the letters? ? Her eyes widened in shock. Ethan, no, they're not about you. Then what are they about? Because it feels like you're keeping something from me. She took a deep breath, her expression softening. I'm not hiding anything. I've been talking to my mom, my sister, trying to figure out how to help you. Help me? You've changed, Ethan. These letters are consuming you. I'm worried about you, and I didn't know how to handle it alone. Her words hit him like a blow. He wanted to believe her, to trust her, but the letters had wormed their way into his psyche, twisting his thoughts. Then why didn't you just tell me? He asked, his voice breaking. Because you're already carrying so much, she replied, tears brimming in her eyes. I didn't want to make it worse. Ethan sat down heavily, guilt and paranoia warring within him. I don't know what's real anymore, Sophie. I don't know who to trust. I'm here, she said, kneeling beside him. I'm on your side, always. For a brief moment, her words eased his mind, but the peace was short-lived. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He replayed their conversation over and over, searching for cracks in her story. Was she truly being supportive, or was she hiding something deeper? Unable to rest, he went to her phone while she slept. His hands trembled as he unlocked it. She'd given him her password years ago, and he'd never had reason to use it until now. The messages were mundane. Family group chats, random memes, dinner plans with friends. Nothing incriminating. But then he found an unsent draft in her email. I can't keep this up much longer. He's getting worse. What if the letters are coming from... The draft ended abruptly, as though she'd stopped mid-thought. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Was she suggesting he was the source of the letters? He put the phone back and returned to bed, his mind spiraling. The words in the draft refused to leave him. Was it possible? Could he be sending the letters to himself without realizing it? The idea was absurd, yet it gnawed at him. The gaps in the camera footage, the uncanny knowledge of his private life. It all pointed to someone close. And no one was closer to him than himself. As the hours crept by, Ethan lay in the darkness, questioning everything he thought he knew. The next morning, Ethan avoided Sophie. He couldn't look at her without hearing the words from her unsent email echoing in his mind. Her concern felt like a mask, and every glance or word from her seemed laced with suspicion. She noticed his distance but said nothing at first, giving him space. By the afternoon, though, her patience ran out. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, not meeting her eyes. "You're not fine," she said, stepping closer. "Talk to me, please." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on?" Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The email," he said, his voice rising. "The one you didn't send." Sophie's face paled. "You went through my phone? You're the one writing letters about how I'm losing my mind." Her shock turned to anger. "That's not what it was about. I was trying to figure out how to help you, Ethan. You've been so paranoid, so distant. I didn't know what to do." "You didn't know what to do, so you wrote me off as crazy?" "That's not what I said. You didn't have to say it." The argument escalated, their voices filling the apartment. Every unresolved tension, every lingering doubt boiled to the surface. Sophie tried to explain, but Ethan couldn't hear her over the noise of his own spiraling thoughts. Finally, she grabbed her coat and stormed toward the door. "I can't do this, Ethan. Not like this," she said, her voice trembling. "Then leave," he shouted, regretting the words the moment they left his mouth. Sophie hesitated for a moment, tears in her eyes, before walking out and slamming the door behind her. Ethan sat in the silence that followed, the weight of his outburst sinking in. He wanted to chase after her, to apologize, but he couldn't move. The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. He spent the rest of the day pacing, alternating between guilt and anger. The letters were tearing his life apart, and he was powerless to stop it. That night, another letter arrived. It was taped to the inside of his apartment door, a place only someone with access could reach. His hands trembled as he opened it. "She's gone. You're alone now, just like you deserve." Ethan screamed in frustration, crumpling the letter and throwing it across the room. He tore through the apartment, searching for signs of an intruder, but found nothing. The paranoia reached a breaking point. He called Sophie, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Sophie, I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "Please come back. I can't do this without you." Days passed with no word from her. The letters continued, each one more pointed and cruel than the last. Ethan's apartment became a prison, every shadow a potential threat. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faceless figure, its whispers growing louder and more vicious. One night, in a desperate bid for answers, he set up his cameras again, this time with backups recording on multiple devices. He stayed awake, staring at the monitors, waiting for something, anything to happen. At 3:47 a.m., the screen flickered. A shadow moved across the hallway, just out of frame. Ethan grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the door, his heart pounding. He flung the door open, expecting to confront the writer, but the hallway was empty. On the floor lay another letter. "You're finally ready to meet me." Ethan's breath hitched. He turned the letter over, but it was blank on the back. A single address was scrawled at the bottom. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the address written on the letter. The words seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, daring him to act. He clenched his fists, his mind a tempest of fear, rage, and desperation. This was what he had been waiting for. Proof, a confrontation. But the thought of stepping into the unknown chilled him to his core. He spent the next hour pacing his apartment, debating whether to go. The clock ticked mercilessly, each second amplifying the silence. Finally, unable to bear the suspense, he grabbed his coat and headed out, clutching the letter tightly. The address led him to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The air was heavy with moisture, and a thick fog clung to the ground. The building loomed like a forgotten monolith, its broken windows resembling empty eyes. Ethan parked his car a block away and approached on foot, every crunch of gravel beneath his shoes setting his nerves on edge. The front door creaked open with a push. Inside, the air was damp and metallic, carrying the faint scent of rust and decay. The only light came from a single bulb dangling in the center of the cavernous space, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Ethan," a voice called, low and distorted. He froze, his breath hitching. "Who's there?" "Finally, you've come." The voice echoed from all directions, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Ethan stepped closer to the light, gripping the knife he'd hidden in his pocket. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" the voice taunted. "All your doubts, your fears. Aren't you curious where it all leads?" "Show yourself," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. A figure stepped into the light, draped in a long black coat. The hood obscured their face, but their presence radiated menace. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. The figure tilted their head. "You don't recognize me?" Ethan's grip on the knife tightened. "Stop playing games." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down his spine. "Oh, Ethan, you've been so entertaining. Watching you unravel, destroy your relationships. I couldn't have planned it better myself. What do you want from me?" "I want you to see the truth." The figure reached into their coat and pulled out a stack of letters. They tossed them to the ground, where they scattered like fallen leaves. Ethan's heart sank as he recognized his own handwriting on every single one. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Yes," the figure replied, their voice dripping with malice. "You wrote every letter, Ethan. You just don't remember." "That's not possible," he shouted, backing away. The figure stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. "Isn't it? Think about the gaps in your memory, the nights you can't explain, the cameras you set up only to find nothing. You've been your own tormentor all along." Ethan's mind raced, fragments of forgotten moments flashing before him, scribbling in notebooks late at night, tearing pages from journals, slipping letters under his own door. "No, no, this is a trick," he screamed, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The figure stopped just short of the light, their face still obscured. "You wanted to destroy yourself, Ethan, and you did. But now, you have a choice." "What choice?" "Embrace the truth, or let it consume you." Ethan stood paralyzed, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. His breathing grew ragged, his vision blurring. "You're lying," he muttered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. The figure extended a hand, palm up. "It's time to stop running, Ethan." Tears streamed down his face as he fell to his knees, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. "I didn't want this," he whispered. "But you needed it," the figure replied. As the figure stepped fully into the light, Ethan braced himself to see their face. But the space beneath the hood was empty, a hollow void that mirrored his own despair. The warehouse began to dissolve around him, the walls crumbling into darkness. Ethan closed his eyes, the void swallowing him whole. Ethan woke with a jolt, gasping for air. He was back in his apartment, seated at his desk. Papers were scattered around him, the lamp overhead casting a harsh, white glow. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, pale, haunted, and drenched in sweat. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But then he saw the letters. Dozens of them, piled neatly in the center of the desk, all written in his handwriting. He reached for one with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the familiar words. It was the first letter, the one that had started it all. His breath hitched as he read it again, this time with the understanding that every cruel word had come from his own mind. "You don't deserve the life you have." Ethan dropped the letter, recoiling from it as if it burned. No, this isn't real," he muttered, backing away from the desk. But the truth was undeniable. He had written them, every single letter. The figure in the warehouse, the empty face. It was all a manifestation of his fractured psyche. The following days were a blur. Ethan barely left his apartment, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He replayed every argument with Sophie, every moment of paranoia, every sleepless night. It had all been his own doing. He wanted to call her, to explain, but what could he say? That he had tormented himself into madness? That he had destroyed their relationship because he couldn't trust his own mind? Instead, he began to write. Not letters, but a journal. He poured everything into its pages. The fear, the guilt, the despair. He wrote about Sophie, about the figure in the warehouse, about the void that had stared back at him. The act of writing felt like peeling away layers of himself, exposing the raw, bleeding truth beneath. Weeks passed. The letters stopped, but their ghost lingered. Ethan started therapy, forcing himself to confront the darkness that had taken root in him. One night, after a particularly grueling session, he sat down with his journal. He flipped to a blank page and stared at it for a long time before writing a single sentence. "I'm ready to move forward." As he closed the journal, a sense of quiet resolve settled over him. He didn't know if Sophie would ever forgive him, or if he could ever fully forgive himself, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He stood and opened the window, letting the crisp night air fill the room. The city stretched out before him, vast and indifferent, but somehow comforting in its enormity. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The void still lingered within him, but it no longer consumed him. For the first time in months, he felt alive. Months later, Ethan sat in a coffee shop, the journal resting on the table in front of him. Its pages were worn, filled with the raw, unfiltered truth of his journey. Sophie walked in, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. She approached hesitantly, her expression unreadable. "Hi," she said softly, standing across from him. "Hi," he replied, his voice steady. She glanced at the journal, then back at him. "You wanted to talk?" "Yeah," Ethan said, sliding the journal toward her. "There's a lot I need to explain. But maybe it's better if you read this first." Sophie hesitated, then took the journal and sat down. As she opened it, Ethan watched her, his heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was no longer running. He was ready to face whatever came next.